Harness the Wind, Chapter 11, Part 1, The Windmill Comes to Life. The following afternoon, I began assembling the machine. I dragged the bicycle, tractor fan, blades, bolts, and dynamo outside and arranged them along the dirt. I'd chosen an area behind the kitchen, which doubled as my laboratory. The acacia tree provided plenty of shade against the mid-morning sun, and I had also determined it was the ideal place to catch the eastern winds that rush over the highlands from the lake. The first thing I wanted to do was to connect the blades to the tractor fan. This called for a drill, so I went into the kitchen and stuck the cob-handled nail into the fire, and once it glowed hot, I bored a square pattern of 4 holes into the top of each plastic blade, plus 2 more in the center. This process of heating, melting, and reheating took nearly 3 hours. Next, I emptied the sack of nuts and bolts that Gilbert had given me onto the ground and started to fashion the first blade. That's when I realized I'd forgotten the washers. Ugh, I shouted, frustrated with myself. Well, I definitely needed washers to secure the bolts, so I spent the next hour collecting bottle caps outside Offici Boozing Center. Once I had about 20, I hurried home, hammered them flat, and used a nail to poke a hole through their middles. Perfect. One by one, I drove the bolts through each washer and tightened the nuts until all 4 blades were connected. Lastly, I wanted to make sure the blades were strong and wouldn't snap in a heavy wind, so I wired 3-foot bamboo reinforcements to each one where they acted like bones. Okay, now, I said, let's have a look. I stood back to examine my work from end to end. The wingspan of the blades stretched more than 8 feet, causing me to giggle with excitement. It was then that I noticed the compound was empty. My sisters were off running errands, and my father was attending a funeral in a nearby village. Besides my clinking and hammering, the only other noise was my mother humming to herself in the kitchen as she prepared a pot of beans for our supper. The privilege of privacy was mine, and I fell into deep concentration. The next thing was to figure out how to connect everything to the bicycle, which wasn't going to be easy. I started by steadying the blades atop 4 tall bricks, like how a mechanic puts a car on blocks, so I would have some room to work underneath. Then came the hard part. The bicycle was not only heavy but cumbersome, especially with a giant shock absorber sticking out from the crankset. But I managed to lift it high enough to flip it over, then drop the shock absorber into the center hole of the tractor fan. Quickly, I crouched down underneath the bricks and jammed a cotter pin through the other end, locking it tight. Finally, I attached the dynamo to the bike frame so its metal wheel hugged against the sidewall of the tire. I strung the chain, which was coated in warm black grease, over the crankset and made sure it held tight against the sprockets. By the time I finished the chain, the sun was setting behind the trees, and soon it would be too dark to work. I packed my tools away in my room, then moved the windmill against the wall of the kitchen and out of the way. I drew a bucket of water from the well and heated it for my bath, and after bathing, headed inside for supper. By then, my sister Rose had returned from the shops and saw me in the courtyard. "William, we haven't seen you all day," she said. "People in the trading center were asking about you." "Well, today your brother was busy," I said. "I told him you were playing with your metals to make power." "Something like that," I said, smiling. "Just wait. Soon you'll be in for a surprise, along with everyone else." I ate my supper like a real working man, saying nothing except to utter a few well-orchestrated grunts. When I finished eating, I returned to my room, lay down on my bed, and was asleep in seconds. The following morning, I was awake at first light and ready to continue. My plan was to build a tall tower for the windmill, but first I had to see if it even worked. For this, I needed something temporary. So I found a thick piece of bamboo more than 6 inches wide and bored a hole through the top, then drove the other end into the dirt. I finished just in time to see Jeffrey ride up on his bicycle from Chipumba. It happened to be his day off, and he was coming to visit me. "Hey, man, just in time," I said. "Is this the same project you were working on?" "Yeah, this is everything. I'm glad you're here, friend. Help me lift this thing." We locked up the bicycle wheel and chain to keep them from spinning, then carefully hoisted the machine onto the pole. I was out of rope, so once it felt sturdy, Jeffrey secured it using long strips from an inner tube. "Shall we?" he asked. "We shall." Jeffrey unlocked the tire so the blades could spin, except we didn't realize how quickly this would happen. In Malawi, the wind is never still. Within seconds, the blades were spinning so fast the chain snapped in half and the pole nearly tipped over. "Hold it!" I shouted. Jeffrey and I barely managed to catch the machine before it crashed to the ground and broke apart. Once we had a grip, I twisted the pole and turned the blades out of the wind's direction. Then I spent the next 2 hours fixing the chain. The main reason for the test was to see if the dynamo produced enough current. I already knew it could power a small bicycle lamp, but what else? I went to my father's room and grabbed his international radio, which was forbidden to me given my history with the family's other electronics. When I returned, Jeffrey gave me a look. "Does your father know you're borrowing this?" he asked. I waved him off. "He's in the trading center. He'll never know it was gone." I jammed the dynamo's 2 wires into the radio's AC socket, and Jeffrey unlocked the windmill blades. They began to twirl, and the dynamo's metal wheels zipped against the spinning tire. For the slightest moment, I heard music. It worked. But a second later, black smoke started to pour out of the speakers. "Oh no," Jeffrey said, and ripped out the wires. The radio sat on the ground between us, sizzling like an egg.